Okay, it's working. Okay, hi everybody. We are in the process of starting here in just a few minutes at 6 o'clock. So just hang out with us here for a minute and we will be right with you. All right, we're about 2 minutes to start time, everybody.
All right. Good evening, everybody. It looks like we are right at 6 o'clock. My phone just chimed on that it's time to have preservation conversations. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our July preservation conversation, The Heart of the Home with Danielle Butler. I'm Patricia Blick, the Executive Director of the QQA, and I'm joined by Shelley Stormo, our Membership and Events Coordinator.
Hi, everybody.
I would like to thank our donors as well as our corporate and individual members. We are able to continue our educational programs with your support. You can find a list of our corporate members on our website at quapaw.com. If you're not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work that we do. Please go to quapaw.com to join for as little as $35 per year or to make a donation. If you join or donate at the $100 level, you will receive our Never, Never, Never Give Up t-shirt. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that we will be taking your questions at the end of the talk. Please type your questions in the chat area of Zoom. We are also sharing this program on YouTube Live, so you can enter your questions in the comment section. On to tonight's preservation conversation. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Danielle Butler. Danielle Butler is a professional in the public history field. She received her MA in public history in 2016 from UA Little Rock. After completing graduate coursework in historic preservation and an internship at the QQA, she developed a love for historic properties and their continued importance. Butler teaches both at UA Little Rock and Ouachita Baptist University in an adjunct capacity. She also serves on the Next Generation Advisory Committee for the Arkansas Humanities Council. In her graduate coursework, Danielle also developed an outreach program focused on the development and changes in kitchens in Arkansas from the 1920s to present. This program explores further research on that topic, looking at changes in domestic labor through the lens of the Boyle House. I was pleased to meet Danielle when I started with the QQA in 2017. She was part of the team that researched the tour houses. I wanted to note that in 2017, with Callie Williams, was awarded the Peg Smith Award at our annual membership meeting. This award is given each year to a QQA member whose volunteer work on QQA projects and programs has been particularly exemplary. So, as you would imagine, I am very pleased to introduce Danielle tonight. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks so much. Let me get my...
There we go. Yeah, I've stopped screen sharing, so it's all yours.
Okay, 1 second. The little window telling me to take over went away. So can everyone see the presentation okay?
Yeah, it looks good. It looks good. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so as Patricia said, in 2016, I was given the unique opportunity to conduct a home tour of the Boyle House at 2020 South Arch. There's a lovely photo of it there. It's in the Governor's Mansion Historic District. And unlike the tours many of you have likely experienced as part of QQA programming, I chose to focus on specific changes made to the layout and technology in the kitchen over the 20th century and how changes in gender roles inform those transformations. Construction began on the Boyle House in 1921. Sterling P. Scott had commissioned the house to be designed by Thomas Harding and Charles Thompson. Before its completion, John F. Boyle and his new bride, Snow Ledbetter Boyle, purchased the home from Scott and made some modifications to the design before its completion in late 1922. The home is well known for its famous chapel room located above the porte cochere on the north side of the house, which you actually can't see in this photograph, but there's a photo at the end of the presentation where you can see it a little better. And the house is largely of a craftsman design with Gothic revival details found within the chapel room and on the impressive stone entrance to the home. I know everybody loves those architectural details, so I wanted to make sure and include them. I'm going to frame this talk through 3 periods of focus, which is similar to how I conducted the home tour. I wanted to focus on the 3 women of the house who made major modifications to the design of the home. So the first woman of the house is Snow Boyle. As I mentioned, she and John were essential in the construction of the home. She was an active socialite and served as the vice president of Boyle Realty after her husband's death. She occupied the home from 1923 until she passed away in 1945. The second owner is Judge Mary McGowan. She was a prominent Little Rock lawyer, and during the time she lived in the home, she was elected circuit court judge, and she lived in the home from 1989 to 2010. The third is Cassie Toro. She's a foster mother and real estate developer who lived in the home from 2010 to 2019. Each woman created a kitchen that fit their lifestyle, and I discussed those design decisions in detail in my 2016 talk. Today, though, I'd like to shift focus to how the presence and type of domestic work that was part of the story of this house affected those choices, as well as how it fits into a greater narrative of these changes that took place in domestic work in the United States in the 20th century and early 21st. Throughout the talk, I will refer to those who may have been historically referred to as servants, maids, housekeepers, cooks, or nannies as domestic workers or household employees. Most of the organizing groups would prefer that terminology. I will discuss 3 types of domestic workers in the talk: live-in domestic workers, full-time domestic workers who did not live in the home, and part-time domestic workers who also did not live in the home. So I want to start with the Boyle family. They're pretty stereotypical members of the early 20th century leisured class. After Snow's first husband died, she married John Boyle. She was already in her 40s and had 2 children. They moved into the house at 2020 Arch Street in 1922. Her social circle was greatly increased by her association as Boyle's wife, and she extended her presence in Little Rock community as a result. She joined the Second Presbyterian Church and became an active member of many additional clubs, including the Women's City Club, Young Women's Christian Association, and the Daughters of the American Revolution. The kitchen was built to facilitate entertainment on a large scale. But unlike today, the kitchen was not the center of entertainment, but a place for the household employees to prepare for the entertainment. The Boyles' live-in domestic worker worked in the kitchen to prepare meals for gatherings. Beyond the preparation of small everyday meals, Snow likely did not use her kitchen very much. I just want to show you some specific parts of the kitchen. So you'll see over near the window side of the dining room where the head of the table is, you see this like small circle that indicates a floor buzzer. And the floor buzzer was used to alert staff that Snow or John required their assistance, and that was probably used during dinner parties. There is also, you'll see a servant's dining alcove where the servants would eat. And there is also a storeroom and preserves closet, which are not very common today. So I just wanted to point those couple of things out real quick. Also, though you can't see it in the photo, there was indoor plumbing, which was pretty new at the time. It allowed for household employees to conveniently perform tasks that would have originally required a trip to the well pump inside. There was originally laundry in the basement, and water lines were run into the laundry area to provide the house staff with running water to do the laundry. In the kitchen, one large basin sink was located near to where the current sink is located, which you'll see in a photograph later, and was likely similar in style to the basin sink that was installed in the latest remodel. In the area, I already pointed out the employees' eating area. Though Snow entertained more in the 1930s than she did when she was married to her first husband, Cal Ledbetter, the census records from the period show a decrease in household employees. By 1930, the Boyles had 3 household employees, only one of which was dedicated to housework and lived on the property in the carriage house. The 1930 census indicates that a 19-year-old woman named Margaret Laleski, a first-generation American from Austrian parents, did the bulk of housework in the Boyle home. Additionally, they employed 2 other domestic workers, a chauffeur named William Rowe and a hired man named James Faulkner. Regrettably, I was unable to find any additional information about Margaret, William, or James. They do not appear in earlier or later Little Rock census records and do not appear in the city directory. This is unfortunately common when conducting research on minority communities in the working class in the early 20th century, as the bulk of research is conducted in newspapers, census records, and property records. Without a mention in the census, many of these folks were never afforded the opportunity to purchase property and did not regularly participate in society functions mentioned in the paper. I also did not find an ad specifically advertising for help at the Boyle House, but I was able to find an ad for nearby 2314 Izzard Street, in which the homeowner was in search of a good cook, as indicated in the image here, and was offering a room on the property. These ads were very common in the period, as many of the homes were built with rooms above the carriage house for household employees to live. By the 1920s, this had fallen out of fashion in the northern United States, but it remained pretty common throughout the South until the Great Depression. As technology in homes improved, the need for household employees declined. Time spent in meal preparation and cleanup by 1920 had dropped from 44 hours per week in prior decades to under 30 hours. Less help could presumably do more work with the advent of electricity in homes, indoor plumbing, and the expediency of cooking through modernized fuel types. On the one hand, wealthy homeowners begin to weigh the paradox of having both machines and staff in their homes, and on the other hand, in historical record, proved pretty wary of operating the machines themselves. Upon receiving a mail-order vacuum in the 1910s, a woman is recorded to have claiming that the device was so clumsy of construction and so awkward to handle that it would require 2 persons to operate it. It is also unknown if machines were created to fill a void created by the drop in the workforce of those in domestic employment, or if there were less people in domestic employment because of the rise of convenience technologies, as it pretty much happened simultaneously. The situation in the Boyle house mirrored the situation for most domestic workers during the period. I just wanted to share some statistics on domestic work found in the 1930 census. There were about, I had to do math, I didn't do the math prior, about 2,400 domestic workers employed in Little Rock in 1930, but only about 73 of those were male. So overwhelmingly female. And additionally, in Arkansas on the whole, there were about 3,500 domestic employees and only 492 of those were male. By all statistical accounts, the field of domestic service was historically predominantly minority women. There's a small demographic shift throughout the 1910s and 1930s indicated in the census records that resulted in less Black women in domestic work in the South. This is primarily due to the great migration of Black residents from the South to the North. The field of domestic work was largely dominated by Black women prior to 1910. In 1910, prior to Snow's marriage to John Boyle, she employed 3 household workers, all of whom appear to have lived at the residence, and all of whom were Black women. The shift in the makeup of the Boyle family's domestic staff is indicative of larger changes and trends during the period. Put most plainly, racism and lack of afforded opportunity following Reconstruction with the introduction of Jim Crow laws, first introduced in Arkansas in 1873, created a situation in which Black women in the city took jobs in domestic service to be able to have gainful employment by any means. And often they still eventually migrated north. This was mostly exclusively in homes of white families like the Boyle family. In 1930, the Boyles employed 1 Black man, 1 first-generation American woman, and 1 white man, just to give you a recap for comparison. The first efforts in organizing domestic labor for better working conditions and fair wages occurred in the early 20th century throughout the Midwest and the East Coast, but not in the South. Unions were formed to give domestic workers access to legal support and organizing power. Unfortunately, most of these unions failed to take hold in their early years. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was proposed, it was presumed that domestic workers would now only be required to work 40 hours per week without being paid overtime. But by the time the law passed in 1938, it included an exclusion for both domestic workers and farm laborers. During the period, there were countless reports of domestic workers being denied wages, fair working hours, or clean living conditions. It would not be until the civil rights movement that any great changes would be made to improve the working and living conditions of household employees. Snow maintained a live-in household employee that lived in the carriage house at the rear of the property for her entire life. Even after having live-in household employees fell out of popularity following World War II, she likely maintained her staff because of the extra responsibilities she took on after John Boyle's death in 1949. Instead of selling her part of her husband's realty company, Snow instead decided to serve as vice president of Boyle Realty following her husband's death. Sorry, there's a typo there. John died in 1939. Snow died in 1948, so it would have been hard for her to take over a company in 1949. Sorry about that. The business was expansive, and her role as vice president was likely a time-consuming one. She was recognized for her contribution to the company in her obituary. Following Snow's death, her sons sold their home at 2020 Arch Street, and Calvin took over as the head of Boyle Realty. Some of the greatest changes in domestic work and in labor in general in the United States took place in the mid-century after the Boyle family sold their home. Unfortunately, there is little known about the lives of the family that lived in the Boyle house from 1949 to 1988. The home was sold to the Archer family after Snow's death, but there's little information on record about the Archer family in the period before the McGowans purchased the home in 1988. This mirrors the timeline of many homes in the Governor's Mansion Historic District. Before organizations like the Quapaw Quarter Association helped to spur a massive rehabilitation effort in the area in the 1980s, when many of the larger, older homes had fallen into disrepair, a lot of these homes were neglected and didn't have documented history. But to account for this gap, I really would like to discuss some of the developments in labor activism and domestic work during the period. There are several Black women from the mid-century that are well known for their activism during the Civil Rights Movement. Arkansas's own Daisy Gatson Bates, Rosa Parks, Angela Davis, Coretta Scott King, and many others. In the post-war period, given the context of Black freedom organizing, Black women began to more systematically challenge the racialized nature of the occupation and the notions of servitude that characterized domestic work. In the 1960s, household employees established local organizations to demand higher wages, contractually based employment, federal labor protections, and recognition of the value of their work. In the realm of domestic labor activism during the Civil Rights Movement, Geraldine Roberts and Dorothy Bolden, both pictured here, this is Dorothy Bolden and this is Geraldine Roberts. They helped create the foundation for a cooperative labor force. Together, they founded the Household Technicians of America, the first national organization of household workers. The HTA connected workers groups from around the country, served as a national voice for this labor constituency, and fought for professionalization, a federal minimum wage, and respect for the work that they did. Geraldine Roberts was an Arkansas native. She relocated to Cleveland, Ohio in the mid-20th century and began working as a domestic worker. She recounted a haunting job interview in which a prospective employer examined her teeth and told her, "Any girl with a mouth this clean and pretty clean teeth was a pretty clean gal, because I don't like dirty help in the house." After Geraldine was fired as a domestic worker from a home in the notoriously segregated Shaker Heights neighborhood, she formed a small organization with 2 other women before joining forces with Dorothy Bolden to create the HTA, which would later crumble due to divisions within the organization. Much has been written on Dorothy Bolden's contributions to the movement, but unfortunately not Geraldine's. Bolden was not only a founding member of the HTA, but eventually the president of the National Domestic Workers Union of America. She was an Atlanta native, and she worked alongside civil rights leaders like John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr. throughout the 1960s and 70s to try to improve working and living conditions of domestic workers throughout the country. Bolden's group pursued national and local legislation and started job placement and training programs that taught workers how to ask diplomatically for vacation time or higher wages. In 1974, the HTA was finally able to get the Fair Labor Standards Act amended to include a provision for domestic workers' entitlement to minimum wage and overtime. For 2 years, the bill was debated in Congress. Delegations of domestic workers lobbied congressional leaders. All of these organizers built alliances with middle-class feminists, but they were acutely aware that middle-class women employed and supervised domestic workers. A core part of their strategy was to testify to the value and meaning of their work. Domestic workers would face many obstacles when enforcing these laws after they passed, but they had some leverage when they were organized, since the demand for their labor was growing. In this period, more middle-class, mostly white, women gained greater access to higher education and previously closed professions. As a result, they displaced their domestic labor primarily onto women of color, who had much less access to these new professions. Feminists demanded government-funded childcare and for men to contribute more to domestic labor and families, but with little success. It wasn't until an influx of migrant labor in the late 1970s and 80s that this dynamic began to change. I just wanted to point out a couple of other images here. So this photo is from 1979 when close to 1,000 home health aides marched to City Hall in New York City. Some of their signs say, "Take us out of slavery, stop denying our right to vote, and home attendants are people too." And like I said, this is a photo of Geraldine. This is a photo of Dorothy. And this is the Household Technicians of America's 3rd conference, which was hosted in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1974. And this is President Carter signing the amendment to the FLSA. By 1989, when the McGowans purchased the Boyle House, live-in domestic work was all but extinct in the southern United States. They had an entirely different perspective on how they might make the kitchen work for their lifestyles. The McGowans will be the first to tell you that they're not culinary masters. You can ask Molly, who's on, I noticed she's on the call today. She's the current president of the QQA board, and her mother is Justice Mary McGowan. Unlike Snow, they did not have live-in help to prepare their meals. The average amount of time spent on meal preparation dropped below 10 hours per week after 1975, and many Americans were beginning to cook less at the end of the 20th century as moderately priced chains sprung up across the country after World War II. Unlike the Boyle family, the McGowans used their kitchen as a space for entertaining. When describing hosting parties, Mary greatly emphasized that the Boyle house had been amazing for entertaining. The McGowans also noted that caterers came into the home for any event they hosted, large or small. Additionally, they hired a self-employed woman to clean their home once a week. At the time of our interview in 2016, Judge McGowan still employed the same woman. Though they did not have people in their home cooking for them every night, household employees in some iteration remained a part of this kitchen well into the late 20th century. Like many other upper middle class white families in the 80s, the McGowans were able to afford someone to come into the home to assist with cleaning. In the 1970s and 1980s, the domestic workforce began to change dramatically. African American women moved out of domestic labor in large numbers into clerical work, sales, the public sector, and professional jobs. Mexican American women in the Southwest also left domestic work for these jobs in larger numbers. This was due to the success of the civil rights movement and modern freedom movements in challenging employment discrimination and creating new educational opportunities. Some continued to do care and cleaning work, but as low-wage service workers in hospitals, schools, nursing homes, hotels, and other institutional settings. Many preferred such work to private household service. This shift led to employers to hire more immigrant workers from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia, also known as the Global South, in much larger numbers. The demand for domestic work also increased in the 1970s and 80s as more women entered the workforce. This meant that more families had to hire someone to care for children, the disabled, the elderly. This demand for domestic labor led many women from the Global South to migrate to the United States and other countries in what is considered the Global North. This is what many refer to as the feminization of migration, since men had mainly migrated in previous decades. Women's labor migration was also a survival strategy. The legacies of colonialism, imperialism, civil wars, and other policies disrupted and destroyed economies in their homelands. Many had to migrate to care for themselves and their families. State-sponsored labor recruitment programs for domestic workers also encouraged them to migrate. The Immigration Acts of 1965 and 86 made this new group of immigrant workers especially vulnerable to exploitation, but neither law created adequate pathways to citizenship for these migrants. As a result, many immigrants could only find largely unregulated, low-wage jobs in the expanding service sector. These situations led to an expansion of corporate structured cleaning companies. And to shift back to the Boyle House, I just wanted to give that context for how domestic labor was changing during the period. The McGowans did love their home at 2020 Arch Street, but after Molly moved out of the home and Tom and Mary separated, maintaining such a large house no longer fit in with their lifestyles. Tom sold the house in 2011 to Cassie Toro. Cassie opted again to remodel the kitchen to suit her lifestyle. The first step in Cassie's plan was to remove the wall that had kept the kitchen as a separate space for its first 90 years. As you can see here, it's this giant opening that used to be a wall. As a single woman, Cassie wanted more of an open floor plan to allow her to be in the kitchen cooking and entertaining and watching her foster children all in the same space. This consideration wouldn't have been something a family like the Boyles would have had to have in mind when they originally designed the kitchen. It was designed to be a space used by domestic staff, whereas for Cassie, the space was going to be primarily used by her. Additionally, there was a carriage house in the back that has been remodeled into an apartment in the remodel of this home, rather than being used as a servant's quarter. By the time Cassie completed the rehabilitation of her home, live-in or even full-time domestic work had become very, very rare. Like many upper middle class folks, Cassie was able to have someone come to her home once per week to clean her home. This was likely done through a cleaning company, though I hadn't asked where she hired the person through. I just want to circle back to the migrant domestic workforce. Migrant domestic labor is ever growing to this day. And as of 2019, domestic workers were more likely than any other type of worker in the United States to have been born abroad. Foreign-born workers make up 34% of the entire domestic workforce, whereas in all other occupations, migrants only make up 16% of the workforce. 68% of those who list their type of domestic work as house cleaning are foreign-born. 50.8% of those workers are undocumented. There also remains a wide and persistent gap in wages for domestic workers compared to other workers within the United States, primarily due to a lack of protections for undocumented workers. Employers in the United States hire immigrant domestic workers for low wages. Those immigrant women then hire poorer women from their home countries for even lower wages, or family members perform this labor. there's an example of a case that I found of a woman named Rowena Batista. She's a college educated 39-year-old woman who cares for a child in Washington, D.C. Rowena has not seen her own son and daughter for more than 2 years. Her salary pays for a nanny in the Philippines, Ana de la Cruz, who cares for her 2 children. This is also the case for many mothers from Central America, Mexico, and other countries in the global South. They must also rely on others to take care of their children while they work in the United States and elsewhere. This cycle fuels the domestic care industry in the United States today and has been titled the global care chain. So I just kind of made a flow chart to demonstrate how this happens. And I just thought that this woman's sign was really powerful, so I just wanted to share it. It says, the grandmother who takes care of the son, of the mother who migrated to take care of the daughter, of the work, of the mother who went to work is tired. Changes in the nature of domestic work in the Boyle House closely mirrored those happening on a national scale from 1923 to 2019. Domestic work went from live-in domestic work to full-time out-of-house domestic work and eventually to part-time domestic work. Labor organizing created pathways for a 40-hour work week. Changes in technology and labor structures for working women led to a need for more workers, but less time individually in the home. And with the influx of migrant work in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the construct of how workers were hired changed as well. Labor organizing amongst migrant workers may lead to additional changes in the coming years to afford these workers the same protections fought for by Black women organizers in the mid-century. That's everything I have. I will take questions now.
Thank
And
you,
that's my
Danielle.
address. If you would like any sources or any of that, I'm happy to share anything. So
Thank you. I actually got a text from someone who had a question, and I put it in our chat just to keep us moving along with that. Were domestic workers' Social Security payments made by the employers?
So for the most part, up until 74, they would not have been employed as like a W-2 worker. So they wouldn't have had Social Security payments made by the employers. They would have been making all of their tax payments themselves as independent contractors, I believe. I don't know how that changed after 1974. I'm not sure. I imagine with the unions, there is some sort of like unions provide a lot of independent contractors ways to negotiate to make sure that that stuff is taken care of. But I imagine it's probably still on a case-by-case basis.
Very good. So, Shelley, did you have any questions that popped up in the YouTube Live?
I do not.
Well, one thing I was amazed by, this is just my personal interest, is even when the house was originally constructed, that was a very large kitchen.
Yeah,
I mean, and I don't know if we've ever quantified, domestic space in that fashion, changes over time. Obviously, this was a substantial house, so it's not middle class, but I am amazed by that size, the fact that you've got your breakfast nook, separate dining room as well. So that really impressed me and made me a little bit jealous in a way, I have to admit.
Yeah, and I didn't mention this in this specific talk, but whenever Cassie redid the floor plan, she made the dining room sort of like a family room and used the breakfast room for eating instead of having like the formal dining room, since that's not really a thing that people in our generation use as much.
Gotcha. So it's also a testament not only of domestic associated household, domestics in a household, but also just changing how we've used our spaces, isn't it? That is very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to see if Shelley has any questions too.
Nope, still no.
Okay. So it will linger here just for a minute, just because sometimes it takes folks a second to get on the chat, but that is quite interesting and quite telling as well. Just the challenges that domestic employees have, not only in the past but even today. That's quite sobering, frankly.
I agree.
Okay, so I think I'm going to turn off your share. Oh, we have a question here. and a comment. So I'm curious if you wanted to do more research on the 3 workers you found in the census, where you might go next beyond the usual sources.
That's a good question. Later in time, there's some other things I could explore. There may have been mentions of them in the paper later. It's very poorly indexed between copyright and when it's digitally available in the 90s for the Arkansas Democrat and Gazette. So it is possible that like actually digging might find something in the paper, just an announcement of a marriage or something like that. Additionally, county records for marriage and death. I wasn't able to find anything in Ancestry, but again, some things are really poorly indexed. So it is possible that if I had an idea of a year or something, just looking through the actual books might get me somewhere.
Right. It's just a lot of digging, isn't it? Looking for any connection to an address or a family name. Molly, as you noted, Molly McGowan McNulty was on, and she said, "Thanks, Danielle. Excellent job. It was a great house to grow up in. I imagine it was." And Acadia was also just saying, finding herself interested in sleuthing. Melissa was asking, in today's dollars, what did the domestic workers earn? Is that information available to you, or have you ever calculated that?
So I know so the census didn't capture income in the period that I was looking at, income levels for specific things, but there's probably other kinds of reports I could have looked at. I haven't done a lot of labor research, so that was a new for me, but I know 50 an hour and the average in Arkansas is $7.50 to $9 an hour. So
Wow.
I don't know historically though, and there may be some way I could find that I haven't discovered yet.
We did have a comment from the Biggers. Calvin Biggers can especially tell you about the Archers who lived there before the McGowans. The carriage house was all rental. The front room, stepping down, was also an apartment. So I'm going to see if I can pull Calvin on to talk with us if you'd like to. Calvin, do you want to jump in and say anything? If you can unmute yourself, I've added you to our sharing screen. I can't, we don't have you on there, but if you can unmute yourself, we wouldn't mind you filling in some gaps. Sarah Spencer, have you found first-person narratives of household help in Arkansas?
So there's an oral history project that I believe was done in, it's either Alabama or Georgia. It's escaping me at the moment, but it's essentially the story that the help is based on, where a reporter went around and interviewed domestic workers. And I don't believe there's any content like that was captured in Arkansas, but I believe there are workers who worked in Arkansas and other states that were captured. There are also a lot of oral history interviews done through labor archives, but not very many of them are digitized or even transcriptions scanned. So as far as like content wise, there's not a lot out there, but I'm sure that there are Arkansas domestic workers in that content. This definitely showed me in the little time I had to do the research that even just the woman that I mentioned, I'm gonna skip back here. Even this woman that I mentioned, she was I just forgot her name, I'm so sorry. I'm really bad with names, this is not my skill set. Where are you? Geraldine Roberts, there she is. As much as impactful as she was to the movement, helping found the first organizing association, there isn't even like a biography for her on the internet. There's like a couple of sentences. And I was able to find an oral history and listen to it, and that's how I found out she was from Arkansas, but she doesn't really dive into much. So even like specific organizers that had a lot of clout in the labor movement don't have a lot of research done on them. So it's definitely, as I was doing this research, I learned pretty quickly that like this is something I'd love to dive into more because there's just really not enough on it. Acadia, do you know of any domestic worker oral histories from Arkansas?
I'm going to invite Acadia to talk if she'd like to as well. Acadia, did you want to say anything or?
Hey y'all. I don't know of any especially organized groups but I'll keep thinking on that.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you
I
for
like to
jumping
bother
on.
Katie about these things.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I have any other questions. I couldn't seem to get Calvin and Vita Biggers to unmute. Sarah Spencer said, thank you. Well, that was very interesting. And, once again, it's just a demonstration, even just trying to talk about and tease out these folks, how it's hard to find information about folks who are, I don't want to say living on the fringe, but somewhat disenfranchised or secondary citizens.
Literally underrepresented.
Yeah, very much underrepresented, very much so, which is challenging for sure. And certainly one of the things we talk about is we're looking at resources that we need to protect. It's those resources of underrepresented communities too. But thank you. And we'll just kind of keep our eyes open to chats. It looks like we had. Oh, so Vita is the one who reached out and said, Cal Biggers, her husband, can fill us in a little bit more on the family that was there before the McGowans. So we might circle back with them. So we'll connect with him. We'll circle back and see where we can fill in some of those gaps. So thank you very much for sharing the possibility of getting more information. All right, so let's move into our talk about next month. And this is pretty exciting. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the presentation, and then I'll tell you about a little work that Shelley and I have been doing to get ready for next month. So our next preservation conversation will be on Thursday, August the 12th, and the title is The Lynching of Harry James in Little Rock, and the presentation is by Guy Lancaster, PhD. So for next month's preservation conversation, we are working with our partners at Cromwell to see if it's feasible to hold it in person at the paint factory. We will have it in addition to in person. We will have a Zoom and YouTube live option. So we will be able to have people dial in if they're not able to come in person. And we will probably have to limit the participation to about 50 attendees, just so that we can make sure that everybody has enough room to spread out. So we will be making a decision soon about this. We're sort of following the trends with the infection rates that are going up. So just stay tuned and look for our email announcements, and also check our website, quapaw.com, to see what the decision is going to be. And we'll do that 2 weeks out so that we can send out our reminders and give people time to think about participating. And we'll also have to get prepared to do it in person. So just visit quapaw.com or look at your email updates on what we decide to do for next month's preservation conversation. So thank you very much, Danielle. And thank you everyone for joining tonight. And we look forward to seeing you next month, potentially in person. So everyone take care. Bye.